Hi, I'm Jessica. They forced me to sign a prenup at gunpoint in a lawyer's office while I was still wearing my army dress blues from my father's funeral. His family surrounded me like vultures, whispering about how I didn't deserve their son's money while I clutched the folded flag they'd just handed me at Arlington Cemetery. But the real betrayal wasn't Marcus's controlling mother or his entitled siblings. It was discovering my husband of 3 years was already married to someone else while I was deployed overseas, fighting for a country that couldn't protect me from the lies waiting at home. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who hate you and realized the person you loved most was the architect of your destruction? Stay with me. You're about to see how a woman who survived 3 tours in Afghanistan took down the man who thought a soldier's honor was something he could steal. The morning started like any other Tuesday in San Antonio, except my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I poured coffee into my father's old Marine Corps mug. The kitchen window overlooked the small garden I'd been trying to resurrect since moving back to Texas, the tomato plants struggling in the harsh August heat just like I was struggling to find my footing in civilian life. The coffee was too strong, bitter on my tongue, but I drank it anyway because Dad always said Marines drink their coffee black, and even though I was Army, some lessons stick with you regardless of branch. I had been out of the service for 8 months, medically discharged after an IED took out my convoy outside Kandahar. The shrapnel in my left leg still ached when the weather changed, and sometimes I'd catch myself limping without realizing it, my body holding onto memories my mind tried to forget. The VA counselor said it was normal, that phantom pain was just another battle scar, but normal felt like a foreign concept when you'd spent the last decade in places where normal could get you killed. Marcus was still asleep upstairs, his breathing deep and even through the thin walls of our rental house. We'd been married for 3 years, but I'd spent most of that time deployed, our relationship sustained by video calls that cut out during sandstorms and letters that took weeks to reach me in the mountains of Afghanistan. He'd proposed over Skype during my second deployment, the ring arriving in a care package along with homemade cookies and a photo of him smiling in front of his family's sprawling estate in Houston. I'd said yes with tears streaming down my face in a tent that smelled like diesel fuel and desert dust, believing I'd found someone who could love a soldier coming home broken. The house we rented was nothing like his family's mansion, a modest 2-bedroom with peeling paint and a leaky faucet I kept meaning to fix. Marcus never complained, at least not directly, but I'd catch him on phone calls with his mother, his voice dropping to a whisper when he thought I couldn't hear. Words like temporary and making do floated through the walls, and I'd pretend I was checking my email while my stomach twisted with something that felt suspiciously like shame. His family had money, the kind of old Texas oil money that came with country club memberships and annual charity galas where women wore dresses that cost more than my monthly disability check. They'd tolerated me during our brief courtship, their smiles tight and practiced when Marcus brought me around. But I always felt like I was wearing the wrong uniform, speaking the wrong language, existing in the wrong tax bracket for their son's affections. The phone rang, cutting through the morning quiet like incoming artillery, and I nearly dropped the coffee mug. Civilian life hadn't dulled my combat reflexes. Loud noises still made me reach for weapons that weren't there, my body remembering threats my mind couldn't quite place. I checked the caller ID and felt my chest tighten when I saw my lawyer's name, Patricia Chen, the woman who'd been helping me navigate the VA benefits system and the mountain of paperwork that came with transitioning from soldier to civilian. Jessica? Patricia's voice was careful, measured in a way that made my military training kick in. In the service, you learn to read voices like weather patterns, listening for the storms hidden behind calm words. We need to talk. Can you come to my office this morning? What's wrong? I asked, already reaching for my keys with my free hand. Patricia wasn't the type to waste time on social calls, and her tone carried the weight of bad news delivered to families at doorsteps in the middle of the night. I can't discuss it over the phone, she said, and I heard papers rustling in the background. But bring any documentation you have regarding your marriage to Marcus. Everything. Marriage certificate, joint accounts, insurance policies, anything with both your names on it. My stomach dropped, the coffee suddenly tasting like ash in my mouth. Patricia, you're scaring me. Just come in, Jessica, as soon as you can. The line went dead, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a cooling cup of coffee and a growing sense of dread that felt too familiar, like the weight of body armor before a patrol through hostile territory. I'd learned to trust my instincts in the army, to listen to the voice that whispered warnings when something felt wrong, and right now every alarm in my head was screaming. I found Marcus in the shower, steam fogging the bathroom mirror, his voice carrying over the sound of running water as he hummed something I didn't recognize. For a moment, I stood in the doorway, watching the shadow of his form through the frosted glass, remembering the man I'd fallen in love with through pixelated video calls and handwritten letters. He'd been my anchor during the worst deployments, the voice that talked me through panic attacks when the mortars fell too close, the promise of home when home felt like a concept from another lifetime. "I have to run to Patricia's office," I called through the steam, testing the words to see how they felt in my mouth. "She needs some paperwork." "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, but his tone was casual, distracted, the way people sound when they're not really listening to the answer. "She didn't say, probably just more VA stuff." He murmured, already moving on to shampooing his hair. "I'll probably be at the office late tonight. Big presentation tomorrow." I stood there for another moment, studying his shadow through the glass, looking for some sign of the deception that Patricia's call suggested. But he looked the same as always, just my husband taking a shower on a Tuesday morning, humming a tune I couldn't place while the woman he'd married prepared to discover how thoroughly he'd destroyed her life. The drive to Patricia's office took me through downtown San Antonio, past the Riverwalk where tourists posed for photos, and the Majestic Theater, where I'd seen my first Broadway show on a date with Marcus during his brief visit while I was on leave. The city felt different now, colors too bright, sounds too loud, like I was seeing it through a filter I couldn't quite adjust. Combat had taught me that everything could change in an instant, that the familiar landscape could transform into a battlefield without warning, but I'd thought I was safe here, in this place I was trying to call home. Patricia's office was on the 4th floor of a glass building that reflected the morning sun like a signal mirror, and I took the elevator up with my hands clasped behind my back in a position of attention I couldn't quite shake. The hallway smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies, familiar scents that should have been comforting but instead felt like the calm before an ambush. Her secretary, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, smiled sympathetically when I approached her desk. "She's waiting for you, honey. Go right in." Patricia Chen was a small woman with sharp eyes and a handshake like a vice grip, the kind of lawyer who'd built her practice defending veterans against bureaucracy and corporate indifference. Her office walls were covered with photos of clients in uniform, men and women who'd fought overseas and come home to fight different battles in courtrooms and government offices. I'd trusted her with my benefits case, my disability claim, my transition to civilian life, and now she was looking at me with an expression I'd seen on commanding officers' faces when they had to deliver news that would change everything. "Sit down, Jessica," she said, gesturing to the leather chair across from her desk. "We have a lot to discuss." The morning had started with such ordinary promise. I'd woken up in the bed Marcus and I shared, sunlight filtering through the curtains we'd picked out together at Target during one of his rare visits while I was stationed at Fort Hood. The sheets still smelled like his cologne, something expensive his mother had given him for Christmas, and for a few drowsy minutes I'd allowed myself to believe we were just a normal couple starting another normal day in our normal life. I'd made breakfast the way I always did, scrambled eggs with cheese and toast cut diagonally, because Marcus liked it that way, though he rarely ate more than a few bites before rushing off to his job at his father's investment firm. The kitchen radio played soft jazz, the kind of music that felt safe and predictable, nothing like the constant hum of generators and distant explosions that had been my soundtrack for so many years overseas. Marcus had kissed my forehead before leaving, a quick, distracted gesture as he grabbed his coffee mug and briefcase. "Love you, Jess," he'd said, the words automatic, like a soldier reciting rank and serial number. I'd watched him back out of our driveway in the BMW his parents had given him for his birthday, the morning sun glinting off the pristine paint job that never seemed to collect dust or scratches the way normal cars did. After he left, I'd settled into my routine of job searching and physical therapy exercises, the mundane tasks that filled the hours between doctor appointments and VA meetings. The silence in the house felt different than it had during deployment, less like absence and more like emptiness. But I'd told myself that was normal too. Civilian marriages were different from military ones. They didn't have the intensity of goodbye kisses before dangerous missions, or the desperate relief of reunion after months apart. I'd been folding laundry when the urge to organize our important documents struck me, one of those random domestic impulses that felt like progress toward building a real life. The filing cabinet in our bedroom closet contained the paper trail of our relationship: insurance policies, bank statements, my discharge paperwork, and the marriage certificate we'd obtained at the courthouse before my final deployment. I'd wanted a real wedding when I got back, something with white dresses and flower bouquets and all the traditional elements I'd missed while saying vows in my dress uniform between training exercises. The certificate was exactly where I'd left it, filed alphabetically under M for marriage. But as I pulled it out to make copies for our joint insurance policy, something caught my eye. The date looked wrong somehow, though I couldn't immediately place why. I'd been so focused on getting the legal paperwork completed before shipping out that the details had blurred together in my memory, lost in the chaos of pre-deployment preparations and the emotional weight of leaving my new husband for what we'd hoped would be my final tour. I carried the certificate to the kitchen table where the light was better, spreading it flat against the worn wooden surface that came with the rental house. The official seal of Bexar County stared back at me, raised and embossed like a military commendation, but as I read through the careful typescript, a chill crawled up my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The date was correct, but something about Marcus's signature nagged at me. I'd seen him sign documents dozens of times, watched him scrawl his name across birthday cards and lease agreements and Christmas gifts, but this signature looked different somehow. More careful, more practiced, like someone concentrating on making sure every letter was perfect. I told myself I was being paranoid, that stress and adjustment disorder were making me see problems where none existed, but the feeling persisted like a splinter under my skin. I'd been reaching for my phone to call Marcus when it rang first, Patricia's name appearing on the screen like a lifeline I didn't know I needed. Her voice had been professional but strained, carrying undertones I recognized from briefings that preceded difficult missions. Military spouses learned to read between the lines of official communications, to hear the warnings hidden in careful language, and every instinct I'd developed during a decade of service was suddenly alert and focused. Now, sitting in Patricia's office with its law books and client photos and the faint smell of coffee and stress, I felt like I was back in a command tent waiting for mission orders that would determine whether I came home alive. The leather chair creaked as I shifted, my hands automatically moving to the position of attention that still felt more natural than any civilian posture I'd tried to adopt. Patricia's desk was organized with military precision, files stacked at perfect right angles, pens arranged in order of length, a coffee mug positioned exactly parallel to her keyboard. She'd mentioned during our first meeting that her father had been in the Navy, and now I could see his influence in the way she structured her workspace like a ship's bridge, everything in its proper place and ready for action. I received an interesting call yesterday, Patricia began, her fingers steepled in front of her like she was preparing to deliver a mission briefing. From a colleague in Houston who specializes in family law. She was researching a case involving bigamy and fraud, and your husband's name came up in her investigation. The words hit me like incoming fire, sudden and devastating and impossible to process in the moment they struck. Bigamy. Fraud. Marcus's name. The concepts swirled together in my mind like debris from an explosion. Pieces of information that couldn't possibly fit together in any configuration that made sense. I don't understand, I said, though part of me was already beginning to understand more than I wanted to. Military training taught you to accept information quickly, to adapt to changing circumstances without wasting time on denial or disbelief, but this felt like a direct hit to everything I'd built my life around. Patricia opened a file folder, with the careful deliberation of someone defusing an explosive device. Marcus Williams was married in Harris County, Texas on June 15, 2018, to a woman named Catherine Morrison. They're still legally married, Jessica. Their divorce was never finalized. The room tilted sideways, gravity shifting like it did during mortar attacks when the ground beneath your feet suddenly became unreliable. June 15, 2018. I'd been deployed in Afghanistan then, counting down the days until I could come home and start planning our wedding, saving money for a white dress and dreaming about a ceremony where my father could walk me down the aisle in his dress blues. That's impossible, I heard myself saying, though the words sounded distant and hollow. We got married in 2021. I have the certificate. You have a certificate, Patricia corrected gently. But Marcus was already married when he signed it. Which means your marriage isn't legal, Jessica. You're not his wife. You never were. The filing cabinet in our bedroom flashed through my mind, all those careful documents organized alphabetically, and I thought about the signature that had looked wrong somehow. How many times had Marcus practiced writing his name on fake documents? How many lies had he rehearsed until they sounded like truth? The woman in Houston, Catherine Morrison, hired a private investigator when she discovered Marcus had been living a double life. She's been trying to track down his assets for their divorce proceedings, and that's when she found evidence of your marriage. Patricia's voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the anger underneath, the controlled fury of someone who'd spent her career fighting for people who'd been betrayed by the systems meant to protect them. I thought about all the nights I'd called Marcus from base, the static-filled conversations where he'd told me about his day at work, his weekend plans with friends, his family dinners with parents who barely tolerated my existence. Had Catherine been there during those calls? Had she been sitting next to him while he whispered sweet lies to a soldier 8,000 miles away? Where is she now? I asked. Catherine, living in their house in River Oaks. The house Marcus told her was a rental, while he figured out what to do about his deployment-crazy girlfriend who wouldn't leave him alone. Patricia's expression hardened, her prosecutor's instincts showing through the careful neutrality she usually maintained. She has photos, Jessica, of Marcus at family gatherings, social events, business functions. Photos that span the entire time you thought you were married to him. The morning light streaming through Patricia's office windows suddenly felt too bright, too harsh, illuminating details I didn't want to see clearly. I thought about the Christmas gifts Marcus's family gave me. Always practical things like gift cards and kitchen appliances. Never jewelry or personal items that might suggest permanence. I thought about the way his mother's eyes would glide past me at family dinners, like I was furniture she was planning to replace. How long? I whispered. How long has this been going on? Patricia consulted her notes, her movements precise and careful. According to the investigator's report, Marcus and Catherine were high school sweethearts. They got married right after college, bought a house in River Oaks, started building what looked like a traditional life. But Marcus had gambling debts, business ventures that failed, a lifestyle his family's money couldn't quite support. When he met you, he saw an opportunity. An opportunity. That's what I'd been to, the man I'd loved, the man I'd dreamed about during the longest nights in the desert, the man whose photo I'd carried through firefights and convoy runs, and all the moments when I'd needed something worth surviving for. The walls of Patricia's office seemed to close in as she opened another file, this one thicker than the first, stuffed with photographs and documents that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my life. My throat felt dry, like I'd been breathing desert air for hours, and I found myself gripping the arms of the leather chair so tightly my knuckles had gone white. There's more, Jessica, Patricia said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who delivered devastating news to too many clients. And I need you to see all of it before we decide how to proceed. She slid the first photograph across her desk, and I felt my world tilt on its axis. It was Marcus, unmistakably Marcus, standing in front of a massive stone house with wraparound porches and perfectly manicured gardens. But he wasn't alone. A woman with auburn hair and a bright smile stood beside him, her left hand prominently displayed as she showed off a diamond ring that caught the camera's flash like a star. They looked happy, comfortable, like people who'd never had to question whether they belonged together. This was taken at their engagement party in 2017, Patricia explained. 6 months before they got married, and 4 years before you thought you married him. I stared at the photo until my eyes burned, studying every detail like I was analyzing enemy positions through a rifle scope. The woman, Catherine, was beautiful, in a way that made sense with Marcus's family. Polished and refined with the kind of effortless elegance that came from never having to worry about money or survival, or whether you'd make it home alive. She wore a white sundress that probably cost more than my military pay for a month, and her smile was genuine, unguarded, the expression of someone who'd never had reason to doubt the man standing beside her. Marcus looked younger in the photo, his face softer somehow, without the careful control I'd learned to recognize during our Skype calls. His arm was wrapped around Catherine's waist with casual possessiveness, and he was looking at her with an expression I thought was reserved for me, the look I'd treasured during our brief visits and carried with me through every dangerous mission. How did he manage it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How did he convince her I didn't exist while convincing me she didn't exist? Patricia pulled out more photographs, spreading them across her desk like evidence in a criminal trial. Marcus and Catherine at what looked like a company Christmas party, both wearing formal attire and standing with an older couple I recognized as his parents. Marcus and Catherine on a beach somewhere tropical, her in a bikini and him in swim trunks, both tanned and laughing at something off camera. Marcus and Catherine cutting a wedding cake, her in a flowing white gown that must have taken months to select, him in a tuxedo that fit him perfectly. He told Catherine that his job required extensive travel, Patricia explained. Business trips that could last for months. International consulting work that meant sporadic communication. She knew he worked for his father's investment firm, but she didn't know the details of his assignments. When he disappeared for weeks at a time, she thought he was closing deals in Europe or Asia. And she believed that? I asked. Though even as the words left my mouth, I realized how easily I'd believed his explanations for why he couldn't visit me more often, why our phone calls were sometimes interrupted, why certain topics made him uncomfortable. He was very convincing, Patricia said grimly, and he had help. His family knew about Catherine, obviously. They'd been planning that wedding for months, paying for venues and flowers and all the things wealthy families do when their son marries the right kind of woman. But they also knew about you, at least to some extent. My stomach dropped as the implications hit me. They knew I existed? According to the investigator, Marcus told his family that he was helping a troubled veteran who'd become obsessed with him during his brief volunteer work at a VA hospital. He painted you as mentally unstable, emotionally dependent, someone who couldn't accept that their relationship was imaginary. The coffee I'd drunk that morning turned to acid in my stomach. I thought about every family dinner I'd attended, every stilted conversation with his mother, every awkward exchange with his siblings. They'd known the entire time that I was living a lie, that the marriage I treasured was a fraud, that the man I loved was performing an elaborate deception with me as his unwitting co-star. They thought they were protecting Catherine from finding out about Marcus's, quote, charity case, Patricia continued. His mother actually bragged to her friends about how generous her son was, spending time with a delusional veteran who couldn't distinguish fantasy from reality. I closed my eyes, but that only made the humiliation sharper, more focused. Every memory I'd cherished was now tainted with this knowledge, every moment of happiness poisoned by understanding how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. The man I'd fallen in love with through letters and video calls had been performing a role, practicing lines he'd deliver to the crazy soldier who couldn't tell the difference between kindness and love. How long has the investigator been watching him? I asked, opening my eyes to find Patricia studying me with the careful attention of someone assessing blast damage. 3 months, she replied. Catherine hired him when she started finding inconsistencies in Marcus's stories. Credit card charges from places he claimed never to have visited, phone records showing calls to numbers she didn't recognize, social media posts that didn't match his supposed travel schedule. Patricia pulled out a manila envelope and extracted what looked like surveillance photos, the kind taken with a long lens from a concealed position. Marcus leaving our rental house in the early morning, Marcus entering a restaurant I'd never heard of, Marcus meeting with a woman at a coffee shop who wasn't Catherine and wasn't me. In every photo he looked relaxed, comfortable, like a man with nothing to hide and no one to deceive. Who is she? I asked, pointing to the unknown woman in the coffee shop photo. The one he's meeting with? We're still working on that, Patricia admitted. But based on their body language and the frequency of their meetings, the investigator believes there might be a third woman involved. Someone else Marcus has been stringing along while maintaining his marriage to Catherine and his fake marriage to you. The room spun around me like the aftermath of a mortar blast, everything familiar suddenly foreign and threatening. 3 women. Marcus had been juggling 3 separate relationships, 3 distinct lies, 3 different versions of himself, tailored to what each woman needed to hear. I thought about my deployment, the lonely nights when his voice over a satellite phone had been my only connection to home, and wondered which of his other women had been comforting him while I was dodging bullets 8,000 miles away. I need to see more, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Military training was kicking in, the ability to function under extreme stress, to gather intelligence even when the intelligence was destroying everything you'd believed about your life. Patricia hesitated, her hand hovering over another file folder. Jessica, some of this is going to be very difficult to see. Are you sure you're ready? I've seen difficult things before, I replied, thinking about roadside bombs and firefights and the faces of soldiers who didn't make it home. Show me everything. She opened the folder and pulled out what looked like financial documents, bank statements, and credit reports, and investment portfolios that painted a picture of Marcus's true financial situation. The numbers swam in front of my eyes, but certain details stood out like muzzle flashes in the dark. Massive gambling debts, failed business ventures, loans taken against Catherine's trust fund, and a pattern of financial deception that spanned years. He married Catherine for her money, Patricia explained. Her family owns a chain of successful hotels throughout Texas, and she inherited a substantial trust fund when she turned 25. Marcus has been using her assets to fund his lifestyle and cover his debts, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. So he found me, I said, the pieces finally clicking into place with sickening clarity. Your military benefits, your VA disability payments, your life insurance policy with him as the beneficiary, Patricia confirmed. Plus, he convinced you to put his name on your bank accounts, didn't he? For convenience while you were deployed? I nodded, remembering how logical it had seemed at the time. Marcus had handled my bills while I was overseas, managed my finances, and taken care of all the practical details that were impossible to handle from a combat zone. I'd trusted him with everything, grateful that someone cared enough to shoulder those burdens, while I focused on staying alive. He's been systematically draining your accounts, Patricia said. Small amounts at first, transfers that looked like legitimate expenses. But over the past 6 months, since your medical discharge, the amounts have gotten larger. He's been using your money to maintain his lifestyle with Catherine while keeping you dependent on him. The fluorescent lights in Patricia's office suddenly felt too bright, too harsh, illuminating every corner of my stupidity with clinical precision. I'd been so grateful to have someone to come home to, so desperate to build a normal life after years of abnormal circumstances, that I'd ignored every warning sign, every inconsistency, every moment when something felt wrong, but I'd talked myself out of trusting my instincts. The drive back to the house I'd thought was my home felt like moving through a dream sequence, everything familiar yet completely alien. The streets of San Antonio blurred past my windshield as I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, Patricia's words echoing in my head like artillery fire in the distance. The manila envelope of evidence sat on my passenger seat like an unexploded ordnance, dangerous and demanding attention I wasn't sure I was ready to give. I pulled into our driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires in a sound that had once meant safety and arrival but now felt like approaching enemy territory. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left that morning. The same peeling paint on the shutters, the same crooked mailbox that Marcus kept promising to fix, the same garden hose coiled by the front steps. But everything had changed in the space between breakfast and lunch, reality shifting so completely that I felt like I was looking at a movie set designed to fool me into believing in something that had never been real. Marcus's BMW was gone, which meant he was still at the office or wherever he actually spent his days when he wasn't performing the role of my husband. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the empty space where his car usually parked, wondering how many lies he'd told me from that exact spot, how many times he'd kissed me goodbye before driving off to see Catherine, or the mysterious third woman, or whoever else was part of his elaborate deception. The key still worked in the front door, which somehow surprised me. Part of me had expected the locks to be changed, the house to reject me now that I knew the truth about my place in Marcus's carefully constructed world. But the door swung open with the same familiar creak, and I stepped into the living room where we'd spent countless evenings watching television and planning a future that had never existed. The couch where we'd cuddled during movies still held the impression of our bodies, 2 slight depressions in the cushions that told the story of shared Sunday afternoons and lazy Saturday mornings. The coffee table still held the stack of magazines I'd been reading, military lifestyle publications mixed with home decorating catalogs, where I'd dog-eared pages of kitchen renovations and backyard landscaping ideas. Everything looked normal, domestic, real, but now I could see it for what it truly was. A carefully maintained stage set designed to convince one audience member that the performance was genuine. I walked through the house with the methodical precision of a soldier clearing a building, examining each room for evidence I'd missed, clues that might have warned me if I'd been paying attention. The bedroom we'd shared held Marcus's clothes in the closet, but now I noticed how few personal items he actually kept here. No family photos on his nightstand, no sentimental objects from his childhood, no college memorabilia or gifts from friends. His presence in the house was surface deep, like someone living out of a suitcase while maintaining the appearance of permanent residence. In the bathroom, his toiletries were arranged with the same temporary quality. Basic items, generic brands, nothing that suggested long-term commitment to this particular space. I'd attributed his minimalism to masculine practicality, but now I understood it was the calculated efficiency of someone who needed to be able to disappear quickly if necessary. The kitchen held more evidence of my naive trust. Bills addressed to both of us sat in a neat pile on the counter. Utilities and insurance statements and credit card offers that had convinced me we were building a legitimate household together. But I could see now that my name was on everything, that Marcus had contributed nothing to our supposed joint financial obligations. I'd been paying for the privilege of being deceived, funding my own elaborate humiliation while he used my money to maintain his real life with his real wife. My phone buzzed with a text message, and Marcus's name appeared on the screen like a knife twist in an open wound. "Working late tonight, don't wait up, love you." The casual lie arrived with the same timestamp as dozens of similar messages over the past months, each one now revealed as cover for whatever he was actually doing with whoever he was actually with. I stared at the message until the screen went dark, then set the phone face down on the counter and tried to breathe through the rage building in my chest. The manila envelope from Patricia's office seemed to pulse with malevolent energy from where I'd placed it on the kitchen table. I'd avoided opening it during the drive home, but now, alone in this house that had never really been mine, I felt ready to confront whatever additional horrors it contained. The photographs spilled across the wooden surface like shrapnel from an explosion, each image a small devastation that added to the larger destruction of everything I'd believed about my life. More surveillance photos showed Marcus and Catherine at places I recognized, restaurants where he'd claimed to be eating alone while traveling for business, hotels where he'd supposedly been staying during extended work trips. In every image, they looked comfortable together, settled into the easy intimacy of a long-term relationship. Catherine's hand on his arm as they walked down a sidewalk, Marcus's fingers intertwined with hers as they waited for a table, both of them laughing at some shared joke that had nothing to do with deployment schedules or VA appointments, or the daily struggles of a veteran trying to rebuild her life. But it was the final photograph that shattered what remained of my composure. Marcus and Catherine standing in front of a for sale sign in the yard of a beautiful colonial house, both of them beaming with the excitement of people planning their future together. Catherine held a set of keys in her raised hand, and Marcus's arm was wrapped around her waist in a gesture of proprietary pride. The date stamp in the corner showed the photo had been taken 2 weeks ago, while I'd been at home planning our anniversary dinner and shopping for a gift to commemorate 3 years of what I'd believed was marriage. They were buying a house together, a real house, in a neighborhood where people had real relationships and real commitments and real reasons to trust each other. While I'd been struggling to make rent on our shabby rental, scraping together money for groceries and utilities and all the mundane expenses of the life I'd thought we were building together, Marcus had been house hunting with his actual wife, planning to move into a place where my existence would never intrude on their happiness. I found myself laughing, a harsh sound that echoed off the kitchen walls and came back to me distorted and ugly. The absurdity of it all struck me like a physical blow. I'd been the other woman in my own marriage, the mistress who didn't even know she was a mistress, the fool who'd been grateful for scraps of attention from a man who'd never belonged to her in the first place. The laughter turned to something else, something harder and more dangerous, as I swept the photographs back into the envelope and stood up from the table. Military training had taught me that intelligence gathering was only the first phase of any operation. Once you understood the enemy's position and capabilities, you moved to the next phase, planning your response. Marcus thought he was dealing with a broken veteran, someone too damaged and dependent to pose a real threat to his carefully constructed deception. He'd calculated that my gratitude would outweigh my suspicion, that my need for stability would override my instinct for self-preservation. He'd seen my combat experience as evidence of weakness rather than strength, my service-related injuries as proof that I was vulnerable rather than dangerous. I walked to the bedroom and pulled my old army duffel bag from the closet, the canvas rough and familiar under my hands. I'd packed and unpacked this bag in barracks around the world, carried it through airports and onto transport planes and into temporary quarters that had felt more like home than this house ever had. Now I began filling it with my actual belongings, the things that belonged to me alone, my military medals, my photographs from deployment, my books and clothes, and the few personal items I'd accumulated during my adult life. Everything else could stay. The furniture we'd supposedly chosen together, the kitchen appliances I'd thought were wedding gifts, the decorative items that had never quite felt like my style but which Marcus had insisted would make the place feel more like home. Let Catherine have it all when she discovered the truth about her husband's extracurricular activities. Let Marcus explain to his real wife why there was evidence of another woman living in a house she'd never heard of. As I packed, I felt something shifting inside me, something cold and hard and familiar from my military days. It was the feeling that came before a mission, the calm focus that settled over you when you accepted that violence was inevitable, and the only variable was who would be left standing when it ended. Marcus had made the mistake of thinking that because he'd fooled me for 3 years, I was incapable of fighting back. He was about to learn the difference between a grateful victim and a trained soldier who'd finally identified her target. The sun was setting by the time I finished packing, casting long shadows across the bedroom floor and painting the walls in shades of gold and amber that should have been beautiful but felt like the lighting for a funeral. I zipped the duffel bag closed and carried it to the front door, setting it down beside my combat boots like equipment staged for deployment. Then I returned to the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and began researching everything I could find about Catherine Morrison Williams and the life she thought she was living with the man she thought was her husband. The research consumed me like a military operation, each piece of information another coordinate in the map of Marcus's deception that I was plotting with surgical precision. Catherine Morrison Williams had a digital footprint that painted the picture of a woman living in blissful ignorance, her social media accounts filled with photographs and updates that chronicled a life I now recognized as built on carefully orchestrated lies. Her Instagram account was a catalog of privilege and happiness, each post a small window into the world Marcus truly inhabited when he wasn't playing house with his fake wife in our rental in San Antonio. Photos of elaborate dinner parties in what must have been their River Oaks mansion. Catherine posed in designer dresses beside tables, set with crystal and silver, that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Marcus appeared in many of the images, always impeccably dressed, his arm around Catherine's waist or his hand resting possessively on her shoulder, as they smiled for the camera, with the easy confidence of people who'd never had to question whether they belonged together. The comments section beneath each photo told its own story of a social circle that knew nothing about my existence. Friends congratulating Catherine on her beautiful home, family members praising Marcus for being such a devoted husband, colleagues from what appeared to be Catherine's job at her family's hotel empire expressing admiration for their seemingly perfect relationship. I scrolled through months of posts, watching their life unfold in carefully curated glimpses that made my throat burn with a mixture of rage and humiliation. One post from 2 months ago showed Catherine holding up a pregnancy test, her face radiant with joy as Marcus kissed her cheek. The caption read, "We're expecting, baby Williams due in spring." The photo had accumulated dozens of congratulatory comments and heart emojis, a digital celebration of new life that made my stomach twist with nausea. While I'd been planning our anniversary dinner and dreaming about the children we might have someday, Marcus had been preparing to start a family with his real wife, the woman who actually mattered in his carefully compartmentalized existence. I stared at that photograph until my eyes burned, studying every detail like I was analyzing enemy intelligence. Catherine's hand rested on her still flat stomach with the protective gesture of early pregnancy, and Marcus's expression was softer than I'd ever seen it. Genuinely tender in a way that made me realize I'd never actually seen him happy. The man in this photograph was in love, truly and completely in love, with the woman carrying his child, and the contrast between his expression here and the careful performance he'd maintained with me was like comparing sunlight to a flickering candle. The business directory search I ran next revealed more about Catherine's family and their wealth than I'd understood from Marcus's casual mentions of her background. Morrison Hotels owned 17 properties throughout Texas and the Southwest, high-end establishments that catered to business travelers and luxury tourists. Catherine's LinkedIn profile listed her as Director of Operations, a position that clearly wasn't ceremonial, given the professional accomplishments and industry awards detailed in her background. She was smart, successful, beautiful, and wealthy, everything Marcus's family would want in a daughter-in-law, and everything I could never be. The property records painted an even clearer picture of the life I'd been excluded from. The house in River Oaks was worth more than I'd earn in a lifetime, purchased under both their names with a mortgage that listed Catherine's trust fund as collateral. But more disturbing were the recent real estate searches that showed Marcus and Catherine had been actively house hunting for months, looking at even larger properties in exclusive neighborhoods where the average home price exceeded my military pension by orders of magnitude. They were planning to upgrade, to move to something even more impressive as their family grew. While I'd been clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores to make ends meet in our rented house with its peeling paint and broken fixtures. The investigators' report included photographs of Marcus and Catherine touring a massive estate in Memorial, both of them pointing excitedly at architectural features and landscaping elements, while a real estate agent trailed behind them taking notes. But it was the financial documents that truly revealed the scope of Marcus's betrayal. Bank statements showed regular transfers from accounts bearing my name to accounts I'd never heard of, amounts that started small but had grown progressively larger over the months since my medical discharge. What I'd thought were legitimate expenses for our household had actually been systematic theft. My disability payments and VA benefits redirected to fund Marcus's real life with his real family. The pattern was methodical, calculated, the work of someone who'd done this before, and refined his technique over time. Small amounts at first, transfers that could be explained as bill payments or household expenses if questioned. But as my trust deepened and my attention to financial details decreased, the amounts had grown bolder. The most recent statements showed thousands of dollars moving from my accounts to investments and purchases that benefited Marcus and Catherine, while leaving me increasingly dependent on credit cards and loans to cover basic living expenses. I printed every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence that told the story of my systematic exploitation, arranging them on the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture too ugly to fully comprehend. The man I'd loved, the man I'd trusted with my life and my future, had been mining my resources like a strip operation, taking everything of value while leaving behind a scarred landscape of debt and deception. The sound of Marcus's BMW in the driveway cut through my concentration like incoming fire, the familiar rumble of the engine that had once meant homecoming but now sounded like approaching danger. I quickly gathered the documents and photographs, stuffing them back into the manila envelope and hiding it in my duffel bag before taking a position at the kitchen sink where I could appear to be washing dishes while actually watching his approach through the window. He looked tired as he climbed out of the car, his usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been somewhere that required him to look less polished than usual. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled, his hair mussed as if someone had been running their fingers through it. I wondered which woman had been touching him. Whether it was Catherine preparing for their evening together, or the mysterious third woman whose identity remained unknown. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and I heard Marcus's footsteps in the hallway, the sound of his briefcase hitting the floor, his keys rattling onto the table we'd supposedly picked out together at a second-hand furniture store. All the domestic sounds of a husband returning home to his wife, except now I understood that I was neither wife nor home, just another performance venue where Marcus practiced his role as a caring partner. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Hey, babe," he called out, his voice carrying the forced cheer of someone who'd been rehearsing his lines during the drive. "Sorry I'm so late." The presentation ran longer than expected, and then the client wanted to grab dinner to discuss the details. I turned from the sink, studying his face with the analytical attention I'd once used to assess whether local nationals in Afghanistan were telling the truth about insurgent activity in their villages. Marcus's expression was carefully neutral, his eyes avoiding direct contact with mine in a way that had once seemed like exhaustion but now looked like guilt. "How did it go?" I asked, testing whether he'd maintain his cover story or elaborate on the lie. "Really well, actually," he replied, loosening his tie with movements that seemed practiced, routine. "I think we'll close the deal by the end of the week. It could mean a promotion, maybe even a transfer to the Houston office." Houston. Where Catherine lived. Where their real house was located. Where their baby would be born and raised in a family that didn't include the disposable veteran Marcus had been using for target practice. The casual mention of Houston felt like a probe, Marcus testing whether I'd resist a move that would actually simplify his life by removing me from San Antonio entirely. "That sounds exciting," I said, my voice steady despite the fury building behind my ribs. "Would we be able to afford a better place if you got promoted?" Something flickered across Marcus's face, quick and hard to read, but I caught it. The momentary calculation of someone deciding how much truth to reveal, how many promises to make to keep his victim compliant just a little longer. "Definitely," he said, moving closer to kiss my forehead in the same distracted way he'd done that morning. "We could look at some really nice places, maybe even buy something instead of renting." The lies flowed from his mouth like water, smooth and practiced and completely convincing if you didn't know that he was already buying a house with someone else. Already planning a future that had no room for the woman standing in front of him washing dishes and believing his stories about promotion and progress and shared dreams. Marcus moved through our evening routine with the same practiced efficiency he'd maintained for months, but now I could see the performance for what it was. He showered while I prepared dinner, the sound of running water masking whatever phone calls he might be making to Catherine, or his mysterious third woman or whoever else required updates on his various deceptions. When he emerged from the bathroom, his hair damp and his expression carefully arranged into the mask of domestic contentment, I watched him with the focused attention of a sniper acquiring a target. Dinner conversation followed the same script we'd repeated countless times. Marcus asking about my day while simultaneously checking his phone with the distracted air of someone whose real attention was always elsewhere. I told him about my appointment with Patricia, carefully omitting any mention of the investigation or the evidence currently hidden in my duffel bag, testing whether he'd show any sign of concern about my meeting with a lawyer who specialized in protecting veterans from fraud and exploitation. "Just routine VA stuff," I said, cutting my chicken into precise pieces while studying his reaction. "Patricia needed some documentation for my benefits review." Marcus murmured, his thumb sliding across his phone screen in the practiced motion of someone scrolling through messages. "Did she say how long the review might take?" The question carried undertones I hadn't noticed before, a careful probing that suggested he was monitoring my financial situation more closely than a supportive husband should need to. I wondered if he was calculating how much longer he could continue draining my accounts before I noticed the discrepancies, or whether he was planning to accelerate his timeline for whatever endgame he'd been working toward. "She didn't give me a specific time frame," I replied, taking a sip of wine and noting how Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "But she mentioned that some cases can take months to resolve, especially when there are questions about asset management or financial oversight." That got his attention. His phone disappeared into his pocket, and his eyes focused on mine with an intensity that felt like being targeted through a rifle scope. "Asset management? What kind of questions?" "Oh, just standard stuff about whether I have adequate support systems in place, whether someone trustworthy is helping me navigate the transition to civilian life." I kept my voice casual, conversational, while watching him process the implications of a government review that might scrutinize his access to my finances. "She said they sometimes find cases where veterans have been taken advantage of by people they trusted." The silence that followed felt charged with electricity. like the moment before lightning strikes. Marcus reached for his wine glass with movements that were too controlled, too deliberate, and I saw his hand tremble slightly as he lifted it to his lips. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely rattled, his careful composure cracking enough to reveal the calculating intelligence underneath. "That's terrible," he said finally, his voice carrying forced sympathy. "I can't imagine how someone could exploit a veteran like that. After everything you've sacrificed for this country, you deserve better." The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. Marcus speaks about exploitation and sacrifice, while simultaneously robbing me blind, expressing outrage about theoretical betrayal, while orchestrating a real one that had consumed 3 years of my life and thousands of dollars of my money. I nodded gravely, playing my part in his performance while mentally cataloging every micro-expression that revealed his growing anxiety. After dinner, Marcus retreated to his laptop with the excuse of finishing work from his fictional presentation, but I could see him from the kitchen where I cleaned dishes, and his screen showed what looked like financial websites and real estate listings rather than business documents. He was researching something urgently, his fingers flying over the keyboard, with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a problem that had just become significantly more complicated. I dried the dishes with methodical precision, using the mundane task to mask my own research as I mentally reviewed everything Patricia had shown me. The timeline of Marcus's deception suddenly made more sense. He'd married Catherine for her family's money, but her trust fund had restrictions and oversight that limited his access. I'd been the perfect supplement, a steady stream of government benefits with minimal supervision, at least until the VA decided to conduct the kind of review that might expose his systematic theft. The pregnancy announcement I'd seen on Catherine's Instagram added another layer of urgency to Marcus's situation. Babies were expensive, especially babies born into the kind of lifestyle Catherine's family expected to maintain. The new house and memorial, the upgraded cars, the private schools and country clubs, and all the accessories of upper-class parenthood required resources that even Catherine's trust fund might not fully cover. Marcus needed to maximize his extraction from my accounts before his scam was discovered, which meant he was probably planning something dramatic in the near future. My phone buzzed with a text message and I glanced down to see Patricia's name on the screen. "Can you meet tomorrow morning? New developments." The message was cryptic but urgent, suggesting that the investigation had uncovered additional information overnight. I typed back a quick confirmation while listening to Marcus's increasingly agitated typing in the next room. "Who was that?" Marcus called out, his voice carrying a note of forced casualness that didn't quite mask his obvious interest in monitoring my communications. "Just Patricia confirming our appointment tomorrow," I replied, noting how his typing stopped completely. "She wants to review some additional paperwork." The sound of his laptop closing was followed by footsteps as Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression carefully arranged but his eyes showing the kind of sharp alertness I'd learned to associate with immediate danger during my time in combat zones. He was fully focused on me now, his usual distracted demeanor replaced by the predatory attention of someone who'd identified a potential threat to his operation. "More paperwork?" he asked, moving closer with movements that seemed casual but felt calculated. "I thought you said this was just routine." "It is routine," I said, hanging up the dish towel and turning to face him directly. "But apparently there are some inconsistencies in my financial records that need clarification. Patricia wants to make sure everything is properly documented before she submits my review." Marcus's face went very still, the kind of absolute motionlessness that preceded either flight or fight. I could see him processing this information, calculating probabilities and options with the rapid-fire analysis of someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. For a moment the mask slipped completely, and I saw the cold intelligence underneath, the predatory calculation that had allowed him to maintain multiple deceptions for years without detection. "Inconsistencies?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register that carried undertones of warning. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "I'm not sure," I lied smoothly, drawing on every interrogation technique I'd learned during military training. "Something about irregular transfers and unusual account activity." Patricia said it's probably just clerical errors, but the VA wants to be thorough. The silence stretched between us like a tripwire, both of us aware that we'd moved beyond casual conversation into something more dangerous. Marcus was evaluating me with the focused attention of someone trying to determine whether I was a threat or merely an obstacle, whether I suspected the truth or was still operating under the comfortable delusion of trust that had sustained our relationship for 3 years. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said finally, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone practicing lines he didn't believe. Financial systems are complicated, especially government ones. There are probably dozens of explanations for whatever they think they've found. "Probably," I agreed, watching as he tried to read my expression for signs of suspicion or discovery. Patricia said these reviews can take months, though. They're very thorough about investigating any potential fraud or exploitation. That last word hit its target like a precision strike. Marcus actually flinched, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second but told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. He was scared, genuinely frightened in a way I'd never seen before, and that fear was making him reckless in ways that would work to my advantage. "Well," he said, forcing his usual smile back into place, "I guess we'll just have to be patient and let them do their job. I'm sure everything will work out fine." But as he turned to leave the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window, and the expression on his face was anything but confident. Marcus was running calculations, planning his next move, preparing for damage control that might require sacrificing assets he'd hoped to keep exploiting. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and he was just beginning to realize that his prey might be more dangerous than he'd anticipated. The morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over our house like smoke from a distant fire. Marcus was already gone when I woke up, his side of the bed cold and undisturbed in a way that suggested he'd either left very early or never come to bed at all. A note on the kitchen counter, written in his careful handwriting, explained that he'd been called in for an emergency meeting and would likely be working late again. The paper felt expensive under my fingers, quality stationery that matched everything else about Marcus's carefully curated image, but the message itself rang false in ways I was finally learning to recognize. I dressed with the methodical precision of someone preparing for combat, choosing clothes that would allow me to move quickly if necessary while maintaining the appearance of a routine day. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized, someone harder and more focused than the grateful veteran who'd been so happy to have someone to come home to. 3 years of deception had carved lines around my eyes and mouth that hadn't been there when I'd returned from my final deployment, but now those lines looked less like damage and more like preparation. The drive to Patricia's office took me through downtown San Antonio in the early morning traffic, past familiar landmarks that felt like remnants from a previous life. The Alamo stood silent in the growing heat, its weathered stone walls, a reminder that battles for independence often required sacrificing everything you thought you couldn't live without. I'd visited the site during my first week back in Texas, standing among the tourists and trying to understand what it meant to fight for something larger than yourself, but now I understood that sometimes the most important battles were personal, intimate, fought against enemies who shared your bed and knew your weaknesses. Patricia's secretary waved me through to the inner office, without the usual pleasantries, her expression grim in a way that suggested whatever new developments had emerged overnight were significant enough to warrant immediate attention. Patricia herself looked like she'd been up all night, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, coffee cups scattered across her desk like evidence of a sustained campaign. "Sit down, Jessica," she said, without preamble, gesturing to the chair I'd occupied the day before. "We have a problem." She opened a file folder that was noticeably thicker than the one she'd shown me yesterday, filled with documents and photographs that spilled across her desk like evidence from a crime scene. The first image that caught my attention was a surveillance photo of Marcus entering what looked like a bank, his expression focused and determined in a way that suggested he was conducting business more urgently than his usual financial management. "This was taken yesterday evening, about 2 hours after you went home," Patricia explained, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd spent her career fighting predators and recognized the signs of escalation. "Marcus visited 3 different banks, all of them institutions, where you have accounts. He attempted to make large withdrawals from your savings and checking accounts, claiming it was for emergency medical expenses. My stomach dropped as the implications hit me. While I'd been sitting at our dinner table, watching him pretend to work on his laptop, Marcus had been systematically attempting to drain every account I had, trying to extract as much money as possible before my meeting with Patricia could expose his theft. The timing wasn't coincidental. My mention of the VA review and Patricia's investigation had triggered a desperate scramble to maximize his take before the operation collapsed. "How much did he get?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Nothing," Patricia replied, and I saw a grim smile cross her face. "I called your bank yesterday afternoon and placed fraud alerts on all your accounts. Any attempt to make large withdrawals or transfers now requires your personal authorization and identification verification that Marcus can't provide." Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt dizzy, but it was quickly followed by a more sobering realization. If Marcus had been desperate enough to attempt multiple bank withdrawals in person, he was probably planning something even more drastic for his next move. Cornered animals were dangerous, and I was beginning to understand that the man I'd lived with for 3 years was considerably more dangerous than I'd given him credit for. "There's more," Patricia continued, pulling out what looked like legal documents bearing official seals and signatures. "The investigator in Houston made contact with Catherine Morrison Williams yesterday evening. She's agreed to cooperate with our investigation, and what she's told us changes everything we thought we knew about Marcus's operation." She handed me a transcript of what appeared to be a recorded conversation, Catherine's words typed out in neat columns that told a story even more disturbing than I'd imagined. According to the transcript, Catherine had been growing suspicious of Marcus's behavior for months, particularly his increasingly erratic schedule and his growing financial pressures, despite his supposed success at his father's investment firm. "She hired her own investigator 3 weeks ago," Patricia explained as I read through Catherine's statement. "But she wasn't looking for evidence of other women. She was trying to determine whether Marcus was involved in some kind of financial fraud or embezzlement scheme." The transcript revealed that Catherine's family had been pressuring Marcus to take a more active role in their hotel business, particularly after the pregnancy announcement made it clear that he would soon be responsible for supporting a growing family. But when Catherine's father attempted to conduct the kind of background check that was standard for senior positions in the family company, discrepancies had emerged that couldn't be easily explained. "Marcus's employment history doesn't match what he told Catherine," Patricia said, pointing to a section of the transcript where Catherine described discovering that her husband had never actually worked for his father's investment firm in any capacity that would justify his claimed income level. "He's been getting money from somewhere else, substantial amounts that allowed him to maintain his lifestyle and support their relationship, but the source of that income was never clear." I thought about all the times Marcus had mentioned his important clients and business travel, the presentations and deals that required him to work late or travel unexpectedly. According to Catherine's investigation, none of those business activities existed in any verifiable form. Marcus's days had been spent managing his various deceptions, moving money between accounts, coordinating schedules to ensure his different women never encountered each other, and maintaining the complex web of lies that supported his entire existence. "But here's the part that's going to shock you," Patricia said, her voice dropping to the tone she used when delivering the worst possible news. "Catherine isn't the only other woman. The investigator has identified at least 4 different women Marcus has been simultaneously deceiving, all of them following similar patterns to what he did with you." She spread out photographs of women I'd never seen before, each one accompanied by documentation that told variations of the same story I'd been living. A divorced nurse in Austin who'd been sending Marcus money for what he claimed were investment opportunities. A widow in Dallas whose late husband's life insurance settlement had been slowly disappearing into accounts Marcus controlled. A young teacher in Houston who'd been convinced to take out loans to help Marcus through a temporary financial crisis that never seemed to resolve. "He's been running a systematic operation," Patricia continued, her voice hard with professional anger. "Each woman believes she's in a committed relationship with a successful businessman who's temporarily experiencing financial difficulties or investment opportunities that require their support. None of them know about the others, and all of them have been contributing money to support what they think is their shared future." The scope of Marcus's deception was staggering, a carefully orchestrated campaign of emotional and financial manipulation that had been operating for years. I'd thought I was the victim of a personal betrayal, But I was actually just one target, in a much larger scheme, one mark in a long-term confidence game that had been refined through practice on multiple victims. How much money are we talking about? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be devastating. Patricia consulted her notes, her expression grim. Preliminary estimates suggest Marcus has extracted over $2 million from his various victims over the past 5 years. Your contributions were significant, but you weren't even his primary source of income. $2 million. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what Marcus had accomplished through systematic deception. He'd created an entire false identity, a fictional business career, a network of relationships based on carefully crafted lies, all in service of extracting money from women who trusted him with their financial security and emotional vulnerability. Where is he now? I asked, suddenly aware that Marcus's early departure and vague note about emergency meetings might have been preparation for something more permanent than a difficult day at work. That's what we're trying to determine, Patricia replied. Catherine hasn't seen him since yesterday morning, and none of his other victims have reported contact in the past 24 hours. His pattern suggests he's preparing to disappear, possibly permanently. The room felt cold despite the Texas heat outside, and I realized I was looking at the end game of Marcus's long-term operation. He'd extracted as much money as possible from his various victims, and now that his deceptions were being exposed, he was preparing to vanish entirely, leaving behind a trail of broken women and empty bank accounts, while he started over somewhere else with a new identity and new targets. But as I sat in Patricia's office, surrounded by evidence of systematic betrayal that went far beyond my personal experience, I felt something shifting inside me that had nothing to do with hurt or humiliation. Marcus had made the mistake of thinking that veterans were easy targets, that our gratitude for civilian acceptance would override our training in warfare and tactics. He was about to learn that some prey fight back, and that the skills that kept soldiers alive in combat zones could be very effectively applied to hunting predators in civilian. The conference room at Patricia's law office filled slowly as the other women arrived, each one carrying the same haunted expression I'd worn for the past 24 hours. They moved with the careful dignity of people whose world had recently exploded, their faces showing varying degrees of shock, anger, and disbelief as they processed the reality of their shared victimization. I watched them enter, these strangers, who were somehow my sisters in deception, and felt a cold fury building that had nothing to do with personal revenge and everything to do with justice. Sarah Chen was the first to arrive, a nurse in her 40s whose scrubs suggested she'd come directly from a night shift at the hospital. Her hands shook slightly as she poured coffee from the pot Patricia's secretary had prepared, and I could see the exhaustion that came from working double shifts to support what she'd believed was Marcus's struggling consulting business. She caught my eye across the room and offered a wan smile that held more pain than any words could have conveyed. Margaret Rodriguez followed, a teacher whose pension fund Marcus had convinced her to liquidate for what he'd described as a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity in renewable energy. She wore a simple dress that had been carefully maintained but showed signs of age, the wardrobe of someone who'd been stretching her budget to accommodate unexpected financial obligations. Her eyes held the particular devastation of someone who trusted an authority figure and been systematically betrayed. The widow, Eleanor Patterson, arrived last, helped by what appeared to be her adult daughter, who wore the protective expression of someone who'd been trying to warn her mother about red flags she'd been too emotionally invested to see. Eleanor moved slowly, her grief for her late husband now complicated by the realization that his life insurance money had been stolen by someone who'd pretended to love her while systematically draining her resources. Patricia closed the conference room door and stood at the head of the table, her expression carrying the controlled anger of a prosecutor preparing to destroy a particularly loathsome defendant. The evidence she'd assembled covered every available surface: photographs and financial documents, and recorded conversations that painted a comprehensive picture of Marcus's operation from multiple angles. Each woman's story was different in its details but identical in its fundamental structure: trust, manipulation, exploitation, betrayal. I've asked you all here because what Marcus Williams has done to each of you individually is part of a much larger criminal enterprise, Patricia began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent her career fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Separately, you might be victims of romantic fraud or financial manipulation. Together, you represent evidence of systematic racketeering that crosses state lines and involves federal crimes. She clicked a remote, and a large screen descended from the ceiling, displaying a timeline that showed Marcus's movements and activities over the past 5 years. Different colored lines represented his relationships with each woman, and the visual representation of his systematic deception was staggering in its complexity and calculated cruelty. He'd been managing multiple full-time deceptions, maintaining separate identities and schedules and emotional commitments, while extracting maximum financial benefit from each relationship. The total amount stolen exceeds $2.3 million, Patricia continued, and I heard sharp intakes of breath around the room as the women processed the scope of what had been taken from them collectively. But this isn't just about money. Marcus Williams has committed identity fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, and what federal prosecutors call romance fraud, which carries significant penalties under federal law. Sarah raised her hand tentatively, her voice barely audible when she spoke. What happens now? Can we get our money back? Patricia's expression softened slightly as she looked at the assembled women, each one carrying the weight of financial devastation and emotional trauma that would take years to fully process. Recovery will depend on what assets we can locate and freeze before Marcus disappears completely. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about compensation anymore. This is about stopping him before he destroys more lives. She clicked to the next slide, which showed Marcus's most recent financial activity, a pattern of rapid asset liquidation and account transfers that suggested he was preparing to flee the country entirely. Bank records showed large cash withdrawals, cryptocurrency purchases, and wire transfers to offshore accounts that would be difficult to trace or recover. He was systematically converting his stolen wealth into portable forms that could be easily transported across international borders. We have maybe 48 hours before he's beyond our reach, Patricia explained. After that, he'll disappear into a country without extradition treaties, and none of you will ever see justice or compensation. But if we act quickly, we can coordinate with federal law enforcement to freeze his assets and arrest him before he escapes. Margaret leaned forward, her teacher's instinct for practical problem-solving evident in her question. What do you need from us? Everything, Patricia replied. Every document, every photograph, every recorded conversation or text message you have from Marcus. Every bank statement showing transfers to accounts he controlled. Every receipt for expenses you covered that he claimed were temporary. Every piece of evidence that demonstrates the systematic nature of his deception. Eleanor's daughter spoke for the first time, her voice tight with protective anger. My mother gave him $70,000 from my father's life insurance. Money that was supposed to ensure her security for the rest of her life. That bastard convinced her it was an investment that would double her money within a year. And it will be, Patricia said firmly, because we're going to make sure Marcus Williams pays for every dollar he's stolen, with interest, and spends the next 20 years in federal prison thinking about the women whose lives he destroyed for his own comfort. She distributed folders to each woman, thick packets containing legal documents and investigative reports that would serve as the foundation for the federal case she was building. The evidence was overwhelming when viewed collectively, a pattern of systematic criminal behavior that no defense attorney would be able to explain away as misunderstandings or failed relationships. There's something else you need to know, Patricia continued, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. Marcus isn't just running from financial consequences. According to our investigation, Catherine Williams, his legal wife, is pregnant with his child. She's been completely unaware of his other relationships. But now that she knows the truth, she's filed for divorce and is cooperating with our investigation. The room fell silent as the women processed this additional layer of betrayal. Not only had Marcus been stealing from them financially, but he'd been maintaining a completely separate family life that rendered all their relationships meaningless. I thought about the pregnancy announcement I'd seen on Catherine's Instagram, the joy on her face as she'd celebrated what she'd believed was a planned pregnancy with a devoted husband. Catherine has agreed to testify about Marcus's deceptions and financial crimes, Patricia continued. She's also provided access to their joint accounts and assets, which will help us trace where your money went and potentially recover significant portions of what was stolen. Sarah's voice was bitter when she spoke. So his real wife gets to keep living in her mansion while we're left with nothing? Catherine is also a victim, Patricia replied firmly. She's been deceived about Marcus's income sources, his business activities, and his character. Her family's money helped fund his lifestyle, but she had no knowledge of where his additional income was coming from. She's lost her marriage, her financial security, and her trust in someone she thought loved her. I found myself speaking for the first time since the meeting began, my voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd spent years learning to channel rage into effective action. What's our timeline? When do we move against him? Patricia smiled, and there was something predatory in her expression that reminded me of the look soldiers got when they'd finally identified their target. Federal agents are already coordinating surveillance and asset seizure. We're going to hit him simultaneously at every location where he keeps money or resources, freeze everything before he can move it offshore, and arrest him before he realizes his operation has been completely exposed. She clicked to a final slide that showed a coordinated law enforcement operation spanning multiple states. Federal agencies working together to dismantle Marcus's criminal enterprise and ensure that justice was served for every woman he'd victimized. The scope of the response was proportional to the scope of his crimes, and for the first time since discovering the truth about my marriage, I felt something approaching satisfaction. "Ladies," Patricia said, looking around the room at faces that were transforming from defeated to determined, "we're going to war." The federal operation moved with the precision of a military campaign, and I found myself thrust into the role of primary witness and tactical consultant, as Agent Rebecca Torres coordinated the multi-state effort to bring Marcus to justice. Torres was a veteran herself, former Air Force who'd transitioned to white-collar crime investigation, and she understood both the strategic thinking required to outmaneuver a sophisticated criminal and the personal stakes involved for the women he'd victimized. We gathered at the FBI field office in San Antonio at dawn, the building humming with the controlled energy of an operation that had been planned down to the minute. Maps covered every available wall space, showing Marcus's known locations, his financial institutions, his travel patterns, and the homes of his various victims. Red pins marked confirmed sightings, blue pins showed his assets, and yellow pins indicated locations where arrests would be made simultaneously to prevent him from being warned by accomplices. Target is currently at the River Oaks residence with Catherine Williams, Torres announced to the assembled team of agents, local police, and financial crimes specialists. Surveillance indicates he arrived there at approximately 2 a.m. and has been inside the house since then. Phone intercepts suggest he's attempting to convince his wife to liquidate additional assets for what he's describing as an emergency business trip to Europe. I studied the surveillance photos of Marcus's actual home, the massive stone mansion where he lived his real life with his real wife, while maintaining the fiction of our modest rental house in San Antonio. The contrast was staggering, like comparing a palace to a military barracks, and I realized that even Catherine's awareness of his deceptions was limited to what he'd chosen to reveal. She still didn't understand the full scope of his operation or the number of women whose lives he'd systematically destroyed. Asset seizure teams are in position at 17 different locations, Torres continued, pointing to locations marked on the detailed maps. Banks, investment firms, safe deposit boxes, and properties where Williams has stored money or valuables. When we execute the arrests, everything gets frozen simultaneously to prevent any assets from disappearing into offshore accounts. Agent Martinez, a specialist in financial crimes, had been tracking Marcus's money movements for the past week, following digital trails that revealed the sophisticated methods he'd used to hide and launder his stolen funds. The amounts were staggering when viewed collectively, not just the $2.3 million stolen from his romantic victims, but additional funds obtained through identity theft, credit fraud, and investment scams targeting elderly victims who'd never met him in person. He's been operating similar schemes in at least 6 different states, Martinez explained, displaying bank records and transaction histories that painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise spanning years. The romance fraud was just one component of a much larger operation. Williams has been using stolen identities to open accounts, forge documents to qualify for loans, and manipulate elderly victims through phone and email scams. The briefing continued with tactical details that felt familiar from my military experience. Entry points, backup plans, contingencies for different scenarios depending on Marcus's reaction to being cornered. But underneath the professional planning was a current of personal investment that went beyond routine law enforcement. Every agent in the room understood that this wasn't just about financial crimes, but about justice for women who'd been targeted, because predators assumed their vulnerability made them easy marks. Torres assigned me to the team that would execute Marcus's arrest at the River Oaks house, partly because my testimony would be crucial for the prosecution, but also because she understood the psychological importance of victims witnessing their abuser being held accountable. I would ride with the lead vehicle, wearing a bulletproof vest and staying behind the tactical team, but close enough to see Marcus's face when he realized that his carefully constructed world had completely collapsed. The drive to Houston took place in a convoy of unmarked vehicles, federal agents coordinating with local police to ensure that Marcus couldn't escape through advance warning or procedural delays. I sat in the passenger seat of Torres's SUV, watching the Texas landscape blur past while monitoring radio chatter that confirmed teams were in position throughout the state. Every aspect of Marcus's operation was being dismantled simultaneously, like a controlled demolition that would leave him with nowhere to run and no resources to fund his escape. "How are you holding up?" Torres asked as we approached the outskirts of Houston, her voice carrying the concern of someone who understood the emotional complexity of confronting your abuser under circumstances where they could no longer hurt you. "I'm ready," I replied, and realized that I meant it completely. The fear and confusion that had dominated my emotions for the past week had crystallized into something harder and more focused. The same mental state that had kept me alive during combat operations, where hesitation could be fatal. Marcus had made the mistake of targeting a soldier, and now he was about to face the consequences of that miscalculation. The River Oaks neighborhood was everything I'd expected from the photographs: tree-lined streets where every house was a monument to wealth and privilege, manicured lawns that looked like golf courses, and security systems that suggested residents who had significant assets to protect. We parked 3 blocks away from Marcus's house, positioning ourselves for rapid response while maintaining visual surveillance through high-powered optics that could monitor the target location without alerting anyone inside. "Catherine Williams is cooperating fully with the operation," Torres informed me as we waited for the synchronized execution time. "She's been instructed to behave normally this morning, to give Marcus no indication that anything has changed. According to the phone taps, he's planning to leave for the airport at 10 a.m., claiming he needs to catch a flight to London for emergency business meetings." London, where he probably had accounts and resources positioned for exactly this kind of emergency escape. But Torres's team had been coordinating with international law enforcement, and even if Marcus managed to reach the airport, he would find his passport flagged and his assets frozen in every country where he might seek refuge. The net was closing from all directions, and there was no escape route he hadn't considered and blocked. At precisely 9:30 a.m., Torres gave the signal that initiated the largest coordinated financial crimes operation in Texas history. Radio chatter erupted with confirmations from teams across the state: assets secured at First National, safety deposit boxes accessed at Commerce Bank. Austin residents surrounded, no movement detected. Each report was another door closing on Marcus's freedom, another avenue of escape being systematically eliminated. The tactical team approached Marcus's house with the practiced efficiency of special operations, spreading out to cover all exits while maintaining the element of surprise that would prevent him from destroying evidence or contacting accomplices who might warn other targets. I watched through binoculars as agents took positions around the massive property, their movements coordinated and professional despite the personal stakes involved for everyone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. Torres's radio crackled with the final confirmation: "All teams in position. Target is confirmed inside the residence. Execute on my mark." She looked at me one final time, her expression carrying both professional satisfaction and personal understanding of what this moment meant for the women Marcus had victimized. "This is for all of you," she said quietly, then keyed her radio with the command that would end Marcus Williams' criminal career forever. The front door of the mansion exploded inward as the tactical team breached the entrance, their shouts of "Federal agents!" echoing through the expensive neighborhood like thunder. I watched through my binoculars as figures in tactical gear flooded into the house, knowing that somewhere inside, Marcus was experiencing the same shock and disorientation I'd felt when his deceptions had first been revealed. But unlike my gradual discovery of the truth, his reckoning was immediate, overwhelming, and completely inescapable. Within minutes, I saw him being led out in handcuffs, his expensive clothes rumpled, and his face showing the kind of genuine fear he'd never allowed his victims to see. For 3 years, he'd controlled every aspect of our interactions, manipulating emotions and circumstances to maintain his advantage. Now he was powerless, surrounded by federal agents who understood exactly what he'd done and were prepared to ensure he faced the full consequences of his crimes. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her pregnant silhouette visible as she watched her husband being arrested for crimes she was still learning about. Even from a distance, I could see her shock and devastation, another victim trying to process the scope of betrayal that had shaped her life without her knowledge. But unlike the rest of us, Catherine would have support, resources, and the legal protection that came with being the cooperating spouse, rather than the targeted victim. Torres handed me her radio so I could hear Marcus's voice as he read his rights, his protests and demands for lawyers, creating a pathetic counterpoint to the professional efficiency of the agents who'd finally brought him to justice. After years of smooth lies and practiced manipulation, he sounded like what he truly was, a criminal who'd been caught and was desperately trying to talk his way out of consequences he'd never planned to face. The courtroom fell silent as Marcus was led to the defendant's table, his expensive suit replaced by the standard orange jumpsuit that marked him as just another federal prisoner awaiting sentencing. 6 months had passed since his arrest. 6 months of legal proceedings and asset recovery efforts that had gradually revealed the true scope of his criminal enterprise. I sat in the gallery with Sarah, Margaret, Eleanor, and Catherine, all of us united by our shared experience of betrayal but no longer defined solely by our victimization. Judge Patricia Hernandez had spent 3 days listening to testimony from Marcus's victims, federal investigators, and financial experts, who'd traced the complex web of accounts and false identities he'd used to steal over $4 million from dozens of women across multiple states. The courtroom had become a place of reckoning, where each woman could finally speak her truth without fear of manipulation or retaliation from the man who'd systematically destroyed their financial security and emotional well-being. Marcus's defense attorney, an expensive criminal lawyer his family had hired, had tried every possible strategy to minimize his client's culpability. Mental illness, gambling addiction, financial pressure from his family's expectations, even claiming that his victims had been willing participants in what he characterized as mutually beneficial relationships. But the evidence was overwhelming, a mountain of documentation that painted an undeniable picture of premeditated fraud executed with cold calculation over many years. The prosecution had presented our stories with clinical precision, using bank records and recorded conversations to demonstrate the systematic nature of Marcus's deceptions. Agent Torres testified about the multi-state investigation, explaining how Marcus had used sophisticated identity theft techniques and psychological manipulation to target women he'd identified as financially vulnerable but emotionally isolated. The pattern was clear and consistent across all his victims: identify targets, establish emotional dependence, extract maximum financial benefit, then discard when the relationship became unprofitable or dangerous. When my turn came to address the court during victim impact statements, I stood at the podium, wearing my Army dress uniform, the same uniform I'd worn to my father's funeral 3 years earlier when this nightmare had begun. The weight of my medals and ribbons felt appropriate for this moment, a reminder that I'd served my country honorably while Marcus had been planning his elaborate fraud scheme. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the emotions churning in my chest. "Marcus Williams didn't just steal money from me. He stole 3 years of my life, my trust in other people, and my belief that the country I'd served had civilians who shared the values of honor and integrity I'd learned in the military." I looked directly at Marcus as I spoke, watching his face for any sign of remorse or understanding, but saw only the same calculating coldness that had allowed him to maintain multiple deceptions for years. He avoided eye contact, staring down at his hands as if the shame of facing his victims was too much to bear. but I suspected his discomfort had more to do with facing the consequences of his actions than feeling genuine guilt for the harm he'd caused. The defendant exploited my service-connected injuries and my gratitude for civilian acceptance to make me compliant and vulnerable, I continued. He used my military benefits to fund his lifestyle with other women while convincing me that my financial struggles were normal and temporary. He turned my patriotism and my trust into weapons against me. Sarah spoke next, her voice breaking as she described working double shifts at the hospital to send money to Marcus for what he'd claimed were emergency business expenses. Margaret followed, explaining how she'd liquidated her teacher's pension to invest in his fictional consulting company. Eleanor's testimony was delivered by her daughter, since the stress of the proceedings had been too much for the elderly widow whose life savings had been stolen during her period of grief. Catherine's testimony was perhaps the most powerful, since she'd been married to Marcus legally and had believed she knew him better than anyone. She described the shock of discovering that her husband had been leading multiple lives, that their home and their relationship had been partially funded by money stolen from women she'd never known existed. Her pregnancy had ended in miscarriage during the stress of Marcus's arrest and the investigation, another casualty of his systematic deception. I want the court to understand that Marcus Williams didn't just commit financial crimes, Catherine said, her hand resting on her now flat stomach. He destroyed families, ended pregnancies, and left a trail of broken women who may never trust anyone again. The financial damage can be calculated, but the emotional and psychological damage he's caused is immeasurable. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized the federal nature of Marcus's crimes, the interstate coordination required for his scheme, and the sophisticated methods he'd used to evade detection while systematically victimizing vulnerable women. The defense made a final plea for leniency, based on Marcus's cooperation with asset recovery efforts and his claimed willingness to make restitution, but their arguments rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence and victim testimony. Judge Hernandez had listened to everything with the focused attention of someone who understood that this case would set important precedents for how federal courts handled romance fraud and systematic financial abuse. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of judicial authority backed by genuine anger at the scope of Marcus's crimes. "Mr. Williams," she said, looking directly at the defendant, "you have committed crimes that strike at the foundation of trust that allows society to function. You have targeted women specifically because you believed their circumstances made them vulnerable to your manipulation. You have shown no genuine remorse for your actions, only regret at being caught." She paused, consulting her notes before delivering the sentence that would determine Marcus's future. "The court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will pay full restitution to all identified victims, plus penalties and interest. All assets obtained through your criminal enterprise are hereby forfeited to the federal government for distribution to your victims." 22 years. Marcus would be nearly 60 when he was released, his prime years spent in federal prison, where his charm and manipulation skills would be worthless against guards and inmates who'd seen every type of criminal and weren't impressed by expensive suits or family connections. The sentence was longer than some murderers received, a recognition that his systematic destruction of trust and security had damaged society in ways that went beyond individual financial losses. As the bailiff led Marcus away, he finally looked back at the gallery where his victims sat, watching his final moments of freedom. For just an instant his mask slipped completely, and I saw the cold rage of someone who'd been thwarted, rather than the remorse of someone who understood the harm he'd caused. Even now, facing decades in prison, Marcus was angry at being caught, rather than sorry for his crimes. But as I watched him disappear through the door that led to the holding cells, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my deployment. Complete peace. Justice had been served, not just for me but for every woman he'd victimized. And the system had worked exactly as it was supposed to work, when people refused to accept injustice and fought back with everything they had. The restitution check arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 18 months after Marcus's sentencing, delivered by certified mail to the small apartment I'd been renting since leaving the house that had never really been my home. The amount was larger than I'd expected, representing not just the money Marcus had stolen from me directly, but also my share of the assets recovered from his other criminal activities and the sale of properties he'd purchased with stolen funds. It wasn't everything I'd lost, but it was enough to rebuild, enough to start over with the kind of financial security I hadn't known since before my deployment. I stood in my kitchen, holding the check and thinking about how different this moment felt from all the times I'd worried about money while Marcus was systematically draining my accounts. The apartment was small but entirely mine, furnished with pieces I'd chosen myself, and decorated with photographs from my military service that no one could use against me as evidence of instability or weakness. The walls held my commendations and service ribbons, reminders of who I'd been before Marcus and who I was becoming again after his deception had been exposed and punished. Agent Torres had called the previous week to inform me that Marcus was adapting poorly to federal prison, his attempts to manipulate guards and inmates resulting in disciplinary actions that would likely extend his sentence through lost good behavior credits. His family had initially tried to maintain contact, but even his mother's loyalty had limits when faced with the scope of his crimes and the public humiliation his arrest had brought to their social circle. He was truly alone now, experiencing the isolation he'd inflicted on his victims while they rebuilt their lives with the support of each other and the justice system that had finally held him accountable. The support group that had emerged from our shared experience had become something more substantial than Patricia had initially envisioned. What started as coordination for the federal prosecution had evolved into genuine friendships based on mutual understanding and shared determination to prevent other women from experiencing what we'd endured. We met monthly, sometimes more often when one of us was struggling with the ongoing process of rebuilding trust and financial security after systematic betrayal. Sarah had used her restitution money to return to school, pursuing a nurse practitioner degree that would give her more independence and financial security than her hospital job had provided. Margaret had bought a small house near the school where she taught, creating the stable home she'd dreamed of, before Marcus had convinced her to liquidate her pension for his fictional investment opportunities. Eleanor had moved in with her daughter's family, using her recovered funds to contribute to her grandchildren's education while finally feeling secure about her financial future. Catherine's situation was more complex, since she'd been both victim and unwitting accomplice in Marcus's schemes. The divorce had been finalized quickly once the full scope of his criminal activities became clear, but the emotional damage was lasting in ways that money couldn't repair. She'd sold the River Oaks mansion and moved to a smaller place across town, using the proceeds to establish a foundation that provided support and legal assistance to women who'd been victimized by romance fraud and financial abuse. The foundation had become my primary focus as I transitioned from victim to advocate, using my military experience and newfound understanding of predatory behavior to help law enforcement agencies identify and prosecute similar cases. Torres had recruited me as a consultant, training other agents to recognize the patterns and psychological techniques that sophisticated fraudsters used to target vulnerable women. My story had become a case study in how veterans could be exploited by civilians who understood their unique vulnerabilities and their gratitude for acceptance in civilian society. Speaking engagements at VA hospitals and veteran support groups had connected me with other women who'd experienced similar exploitation, and the pattern was disturbingly common. Predators specifically targeted female veterans, using their service records and benefit information to identify potential victims with steady income streams and emotional vulnerabilities related to deployment trauma and reintegration difficulties. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying, turning my personal experience of betrayal into a tool for protecting other women from similar predators. The apartment felt different with the restitution check in my possession, not just because of the financial security it represented, but because it marked the final chapter of my victimization and the beginning of whatever came next. I'd spent months in therapy working through the complex emotions of having trusted someone so completely while missing every sign of their deception, but now I understood that my trust hadn't been naive or foolish. Marcus had been a professional criminal with years of experience manipulating vulnerable women, and recognizing his deception would have required knowledge and experience I hadn't possessed at the time. The check would allow me to buy a house, something small but permanent, with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers without worrying about landlords or lease agreements. It would fund additional education, possibly a degree in social work or criminal justice, that would formalize my transition from victim to advocate. Most importantly, it would provide the kind of financial independence that would make me less vulnerable to future predators who might target women with economic insecurities. My phone rang as I was preparing to drive to the bank, and Patricia's name appeared on the screen with news that had become increasingly common as our case inspired other investigations. Another romance fraud operation had been uncovered in Florida, this one targeting elderly widows through dating websites and church social groups. The FBI was requesting my assistance in training their task force, sharing insights about how predators identified and exploited vulnerable targets while maintaining multiple deceptions across extended periods. The work was expanding beyond my personal experience, becoming part of a larger effort to combat sophisticated fraud schemes that preyed on people's basic human need for connection and companionship. Each case taught us more about the methods predators used and the psychological vulnerabilities they exploited, building a database of knowledge that could protect future victims and improve prosecution strategies for cases that crossed state and federal jurisdictions. As I drove to the bank, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years earlier, standing in that parking lot outside Pete's Market with a cup of coffee and complete faith in the man I'd believed was my husband. That woman had been trusting, grateful, and completely unprepared for the systematic betrayal she was about to discover. The woman driving to deposit the restitution check was harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might try to exploit her again. The bank teller who processed my deposit treated it as routine business, unaware that the check represented the end of one of the largest romance fraud prosecutions in federal history. But as I walked back to my car with the receipt, I felt the weight of 3 years of deception finally lifting from my shoulders, replaced by something lighter but stronger. The knowledge that justice was possible, that predators could be held accountable, and that victims could transform their pain into protection for others. The house I bought with the restitution money sat on a quiet street in a neighborhood where people knew their neighbors' names and checked on each other during storms. It was a modest 2-bedroom ranch with a front porch that caught the morning sun and a backyard large enough for the garden I'd been dreaming about since my discharge from the Army. The previous owners had maintained it well, but I could see possibilities everywhere. Fresh paint that would reflect my own taste, a kitchen updated with appliances I'd chosen myself, and most importantly, a space that belonged entirely to me without the shadow of deception hanging over every corner. Moving day brought an unexpected gathering of the women who'd become my chosen family, through our shared experience of betrayal and recovery. Sarah arrived with her new boyfriend, a fellow nurse she'd met during her graduate program who understood her need to move slowly and build trust carefully. Margaret brought homemade cookies and her characteristic practical efficiency, organizing my kitchen while I struggled with assembling furniture that came with instructions written in 3 languages, none of them particularly helpful. Eleanor came with her daughter and grandchildren, the little ones racing through the empty rooms with the boundless energy of children who saw possibilities rather than limitations in unfurnished spaces. Catherine was the last to arrive, carrying a housewarming gift that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion, a framed photograph of all of us from Marcus's sentencing hearing, our faces showing not victory but quiet satisfaction that justice had been served and accountability enforced. "This is what home looks like," Catherine said as we stood on my new front porch, watching her kids play in the yard with Eleanor's grandchildren, while the adults shared coffee and conversation that had nothing to do with court proceedings or criminal investigations. Not the size of the house or the value of the neighborhood, but the people who choose to be in your life because they genuinely care about your happiness. The truth of her words settled over me like morning sunlight, warming places that had been cold for longer than I'd realized. For 3 years, I'd lived in a house with someone who'd performed caring while systematically destroying my financial security and emotional well-being. Now I was surrounded by women who understood both the damage that could be inflicted by intimate betrayal and the healing that came from authentic connections built on mutual respect and shared experience. Agent Torres stopped by later that afternoon, officially to check on my transition, but actually because she'd become genuinely invested in my recovery and the advocacy work that had grown from our professional relationship. She brought files from the Florida case we'd been consulting on, another romance fraud operation that had been dismantled using techniques developed during Marcus's prosecution. The pattern was becoming familiar. Identify vulnerable targets, establish emotional dependence, extract maximum financial benefit, then disappear before consequences could catch up. The defendant in the Florida case is trying to use Marcus's prosecution as precedent for a reduced sentence, Torres explained, as we sat on my new back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of desert sunrises during deployment. His attorney is arguing that 22 years was excessive, that romance fraud doesn't deserve the same penalties as violent crimes. I felt the familiar anger rise in my chest, the controlled fury that had sustained me through months of legal proceedings and victim impact statements. Romance fraud might not leave physical scars, but the psychological damage was profound and lasting, affecting victims' ability to trust, to form relationships, to feel secure in their own judgment. The financial devastation could take decades to recover from, particularly for elderly victims whose retirement savings couldn't be rebuilt through additional employment. "What do you need from me?" I asked, already knowing that I'd testify in whatever proceedings were necessary to ensure that predators faced appropriate consequences for their systematic destruction of trust and security. "The prosecution wants you to address the Federal Sentencing Guidelines Committee," Torres replied. "Your case has become the benchmark for how these crimes should be prosecuted and punished. Your testimony could influence how courts handle similar cases for years to come." The responsibility felt weighty but appropriate, a natural extension of the advocacy work that had given new purpose to my life after military service. Speaking to federal judges and prosecutors about the real impact of romance fraud, educating law enforcement about the sophisticated techniques predators used, and helping other victims navigate the complex process of seeking justice had become more than just personal healing. It was a mission, a way to serve my country by protecting its citizens from criminals who exploited their fundamental human need for connection and companionship. The garden I planted that spring became a metaphor for everything I was rebuilding in my life. Tomatoes and peppers grew alongside flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds, creating a space of beauty and productivity that reflected my own growth from victim to survivor to advocate. Working in the soil with my hands, nurturing plants from seeds to harvest, felt like the most honest work I'd done since leaving the military, connected to cycles of growth and renewal that had nothing to do with deception or exploitation. Neighbors began stopping by as the garden flourished, drawn by curiosity about the new resident who'd transformed an overgrown backyard into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Mrs. Chen from next door brought surplus vegetables from her own garden, creating the kind of casual neighborly exchange that had been impossible when I'd been living Marcus's carefully orchestrated lie. The mailman, a veteran himself, recognized my military bearing and stopped to chat about deployment experiences and the challenges of civilian reintegration. These small interactions, honest and uncomplicated by hidden agendas or systematic deception, felt revolutionary after years of navigating Marcus's elaborate performance. People who spoke truthfully, who meant what they said, who didn't calculate every word for maximum manipulative impact. The simplicity of genuine human connection had become precious in ways I couldn't have understood before experiencing its complete absence. On quiet evenings, I sat on my front porch with coffee that tasted like contentment rather than desperation, watching the neighborhood settle into twilight routines that spoke of stability and community. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalk while their parents chatted across fence lines about ordinary concerns like school events and weekend plans. The normalcy was intoxicating after years of living in Marcus's carefully controlled environment where nothing was quite what it seemed. Sometimes I thought about the woman I'd been before my final deployment, before Marcus, before the systematic betrayal that had nearly destroyed my faith in human decency. That woman had been younger, more trusting, less aware of the sophisticated evil that could hide behind charming smiles and practiced sympathy. I didn't mourn her naivete, but I honored her service and her willingness to believe in love, despite the dangers she'd faced in combat zones around the world. The woman I'd become was harder but not bitter, wiser but not cynical, stronger but not closed off to the possibility of genuine connection. Marcus had tried to break me, to reduce me to a grateful victim who would accept whatever scraps of affection he chose to offer, while he systematically stole my resources and my dignity. Instead, he'd forged me into someone capable of fighting back, of seeking justice, of transforming personal trauma into protection for others. As the first anniversary of moving into my house approached, I realized that home had never been about the building, or the address, or the person sharing the space. Home was the peace of knowing that every decision I made was my own. Every relationship I built was based on truth. Every breath I took was free from the weight of deception. Home was the sound of my own voice speaking honestly, the sight of my own face in the mirror without shame, the feeling of my own heart beating steadily in a chest unburdened by lies. Marcus Williams was serving his time in federal prison, learning that manipulation had no power over guards and inmates who'd seen every variety of criminal charm. But I was living free, surrounded by authentic relationships and meaningful work, rebuilding not just my financial security but my faith in the possibility of justice and genuine human connection. In the end, that was the most complete victory possible, not just surviving his betrayal, but thriving in its aftermath. 5 years later, I stood at the podium of the FBI National Academy, addressing a room full of federal agents who'd come to learn about romance fraud investigation techniques. Behind me, a PowerPoint slide showed Marcus's mugshot next to statistics that made my chest swell with pride. Over 200 similar cases prosecuted using our methods, $50 million recovered for victims, and a 90% conviction rate for predators who thought they could exploit vulnerable women without consequences. The most important thing to remember, I told the assembled agents, is that these aren't just financial crimes. They're attacks on the human capacity for trust, love, and hope. When we prosecute these cases, we're not just seeking justice for individual victims. We're defending the very foundation of human connection. In the audience, Agent Torres smiled and nodded, now running the FBI's Romance Fraud Task Force with me as her chief consultant. Sarah had just graduated as a nurse practitioner and was dating a man who'd waited 2 years for her to feel ready for a serious relationship. Margaret owned her house outright and had started a support group for educators who'd been financially exploited. Eleanor had lived to see her youngest grandchild graduate high school, her final years secure and peaceful. Catherine's foundation had helped over 500 women seek justice and rebuild their lives, turning her own betrayal into a lifeline for others drowning in similar deceptions. As for me, I'd found something better than the fairy tale Marcus had sold me. I'd found purpose, community, and the unshakable knowledge that some pray fight back. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in justice for those who've been betrayed and exploited, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who needs to know that recovery is possible, that predators can be held accountable, and that sometimes the best revenge is a life lived fully and freely on your own terms. Your support helps us tell more stories of survival, justice, and triumph over those who think they can destroy us. Hit that notification bell, because every survivor's story deserves to be heard.